The crystal chandeliers of the Cross estate cast dancing shadows across the marble floors as Natalie Harper pushed her cleaning cart down the servants' corridor. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her black uniform pressed and spotless. She had learned quickly during her 6 months of employment that invisibility was a survival skill in houses like this. The wealthy preferred their staff to move like ghosts, present but unnoticed. Tonight felt different somehow. The air carried a tension that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Sebastian Cross, the estate's owner, was hosting what he called a small business dinner. Small by his standards meant 12 courses and guests who arrived in cars worth more than most homes. Natalie had been assigned to the second floor, well away from the festivities, which suited her fine. The less she interacted with the wealthy and powerful, the better. She was polishing the banister near the East Wing study when she heard voices. Sharp, angry voices that made her freeze mid-motion. The study door was slightly ajar, golden light spilling into the darkened hallway. She knew she should leave, should push her cart away and pretend she heard nothing. That was the first rule they taught new staff. But something in the tone, the urgency mixed with malice, made her pause. "He's getting too close to the truth," a voice hissed. Natalie recognized it as Victor Brennan, Sebastian's longtime business partner. She had served him tea once, remembered his cold eyes and colder smile. "Then we move up the timeline," another voice replied. Deeper, unfamiliar. "The accident needs to happen this week, before he can present those documents to the board." Natalie's heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands gripped the polished cloth so tightly her knuckles turned white. "And you're certain it will look natural?" Victor asked. "The brakes will fail on that mountain road he loves so much. Tragic loss of a brilliant mind. No one will question it. Especially after that anonymous tip about his alleged depression reaches the right ears. They were planning murder. They were planning to kill Sebastian Cross." Natalie's mind raced. She should run, should get as far from this conversation as possible. She had her brother Oliver to think about. Their parents had died 3 years ago, leaving her as his sole guardian at 23. This job paid for his school, his food, his future. She couldn't risk it. But could she live with herself if she said nothing? The conversation continued, details emerging about offshore accounts, falsified records, and a real estate deal that would make both men wealthy beyond measure once Sebastian was gone. Natalie's stomach churned. She had only seen Sebastian Cross from a distance, a tall figure with dark hair and an intense gaze that seemed to see through everything. He rarely acknowledged the staff, but he wasn't cruel either. He paid well, offered benefits that most employers wouldn't consider for domestic workers. He was a human being, and these men were planning to end his life as casually as if they were discussing a business merger. The meeting was breaking up. Natalie heard chairs scraping, footsteps approaching the door. Panic surged through her. If they found her here, if they realized she had heard everything, she wouldn't be the only one in danger. Oliver would be alone. The thought of her little brother, still struggling with their parents' loss, pushed her into motion. She grabbed her cart and moved as quickly as she dared without making noise, rounding the corner just as the study door opened fully. She pressed herself against the wall in an alcove, barely breathing as footsteps passed. 2 sets, confident and unhurried, the footsteps of men who believed themselves untouchable. When silence returned, Natalie sagged against the wall, her whole body trembling. She had heard everything. She knew everything. And now she had to decide what to do with that knowledge. The smart choice was obvious. Keep her head down, protect her job, protect Oliver. Pretend this night never happened. But as she stood there in the shadows of that grand hallway, surrounded by wealth and privilege built on the backs of people like her, Natalie realized something. She had spent 3 years being invisible, being small, being careful. She had lost her parents to a drunk driver whose expensive lawyers got him a light sentence while her family fell apart. She had watched injustice triumph time and time again because good people stayed silent. Maybe it was time to stop being invisible. Sebastian Cross would be driving that mountain road within days, perhaps hours. If she did nothing, his death would be on her hands as surely as if she had cut the brake lines herself. The thought made her sick. But warning him meant exposing herself. risking everything she had worked for, potentially putting Oliver in danger if these men discovered her involvement. Natalie closed her eyes and made her decision. She would find a way to warn him. Somehow, without revealing herself, without losing her job, she would make sure Sebastian Cross knew his life was in danger. She didn't know how yet. She didn't know if he would even believe her. But she knew she had to try. Because sometimes the only thing standing between an innocent person and tragedy is one person willing to speak up, even if that person is just a maid in a mansion full of shadows and secrets. The next morning arrived gray and cold, matching the anxiety that had kept Natalie awake most of the night. She had spent hours staring at her bedroom ceiling in the small apartment she shared with Oliver, rehearsing different scenarios in her mind. How could she warn Sebastian Cross without exposing herself? An anonymous note seemed cowardly and easily dismissed. A phone call could be traced. Direct confrontation was impossible given the hierarchy that separated them. By the time dawn broke, she still had no clear plan, only a growing certainty that time was running out. Oliver had noticed her distraction over breakfast, his young face creasing with concern as he pushed his cereal around the bowl. "You okay, Nat?" he had asked, using the nickname only he was allowed. She had forced a smile, ruffled his brown hair, and sent him off to school with a lunch she barely remembered packing. Now, as she arrived at the Cross estate for her afternoon shift, the mansion loomed before her like a beautiful prison. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, and somewhere inside those walls, Sebastian Cross went about his day completely unaware that death had been scheduled for him. Natalie entered through the staff entrance, changed into her uniform and tried to focus on her assigned tasks. But her hands shook as she folded linens, and she nearly dropped a crystal vase while dusting the library. The other staff members noticed her unusual clumsiness but said nothing. In houses like this, everyone carried their own burdens silently. It was mid-afternoon when opportunity presented itself in the most unexpected way. Harper, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, called sharply, "Mr. Cross has requested tea in his study." The regular service girl called in sick. "You'll have to take it up." Natalie's heart stopped. She had never served Sebastian Cross directly, had never been in the same room with him alone. Staff assignments were carefully structured to maintain distance between the owner and the help. But now fate, or something like it, was handing her exactly what she needed. "Yes, ma'am," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. 20 minutes later, Natalie stood outside the study door with a silver tea service balanced on a tray. Her hands trembled slightly, making the china rattle softly. She took a deep breath, knocked twice, and entered when his voice called permission. Sebastian Cross sat behind a massive mahogany desk, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and afternoon light filtering through tall windows. He was younger than she had realized from her distant observations, perhaps mid-30s, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples and sharp features that suggested both intelligence and intensity. He wore a simple black sweater and jeans, far more casual than the suits she usually saw him in. He didn't look up from the documents he was reviewing. "Just leave it on the side table, please." Natalie moved forward, carefully setting down the tray. This was her moment, her only chance. Her mind raced through the careful words she had practiced, the vague warning that wouldn't reveal too much but would hopefully spark his caution. But as she turned to leave, something made her stop. Perhaps it was the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, or the way his hand rubbed his temple as if fighting a headache, or simply the knowledge that in a few days this man might be dead because she was too afraid to speak plainly. "Sir," she heard herself say, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, seeming to truly see her for the first time. His eyes were gray, she noticed, the color of storm clouds. "Yes? I need to tell you something. Something important." His expression shifted, curiosity replacing distraction. He set down his pen, giving her his full attention in a way that made her feel simultaneously visible and vulnerable. "Go ahead," he said, his voice neither warm nor cold, simply attentive. Natalie's throat went dry. She was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But she thought of Oliver, of the promise she had made to their parents to always do what was right, even when it was hard. especially when it was hard. Last night I was working on the second floor. I overheard a conversation in this study between Mr. Brennan and another man. She watched his expression harden slightly at Victor's name. They were discussing you, discussing an accident, your brakes, the mountain road. The silence that followed felt like it stretched for hours. Sebastian stood slowly, his height suddenly imposing as he moved around the desk. Natalie instinctively took a step back, but he held up a hand. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. "But I need you to tell me everything. Exactly what you heard," and so she did. Standing in that study with afternoon light fading to evening, Natalie recounted every word she could remember. The timeline, the mentions of documents and board meetings, the casual discussion of murder as if it were just another business transaction. Sebastian listened without interruption, his face growing darker with each detail. When she finished, the silence returned. Sebastian moved to the window, staring out at his estate with an expression she couldn't read. "Why are you telling me this?" he finally asked, not turning around. "You could lose your job. Worse, if Victor discovers you overheard them." "Because it's the right thing to do," Natalie said simply. "And because I've lost too many people I care about to stay silent when I could have made a difference." He turned then, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. "What's your name?" "Your full name." "Natalie Harper, sir." "How long have you worked here, Natalie Harper?" 6 months. "And in those 6 months, have I ever spoken to you before today?" "No, sir." Something shifted in his expression. A recognition of the vast distance their society placed between them, and perhaps shame that he had been part of maintaining that distance. "I owe you my life," he said quietly. "That's not something I take lightly." He returned to his desk, pulled out a business card, and wrote something on the back. "This is my private number, the one Victor doesn't know about. If you see anything else, hear anything else, or if you feel threatened in any way, you call me directly. Understand?" Natalie took the card, her fingers brushing his briefly. "Yes, sir." "And Natalie?" He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Thank you. For your courage. For not looking away when it would have been easier." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and turned to leave. "One more thing," he called as she reached the door. She looked back. "You mentioned a brother during your employment interview, didn't you?" "Oliver." She was surprised he knew. "Yes, sir." "How old is he?" 12, Sebastian nodded slowly. "You're very brave, putting yourself at risk when you have someone depending on you. That kind of courage is rare. I won't forget it." As Natalie left the study, her heart pounding and her hands still shaking, she realized something had fundamentally changed. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer safe in her careful anonymity. But perhaps, for the first time since her parents died, she was truly alive. Behind his desk, Sebastian Cross sat down heavily and picked up his phone. He had calls to make, plans to change, and a betrayal to address. But first, he made a note in his personal file about Natalie Harper, not because he might need her testimony, but because he wanted to remember the maid who had risked everything to save a man she barely knew. In a world built on self-interest and carefully calculated advantages, genuine courage was the rarest commodity of all, and he had just witnessed it from the most unexpected source. The game had changed. Victor Brennan thought he held all the cards, but he had made one fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated the power of a single voice willing to speak truth into darkness, and that voice belonged to a woman who had been invisible for far too long. 3 days later, the world of careful plans and hidden corruption began to unravel. Sebastian Cross sat in the offices of Diana Rothwell, the only attorney he trusted completely. She was a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and a reputation for destroying corruption wherever she found it. Her office overlooked the city, glass and chrome reflecting the morning sun, a far cry from the shadowy mansion where secrets had been whispered. "You're certain about this?" Diana asked, reviewing the documents Sebastian had brought. "Once we move forward, there's no turning back." "Victor has powerful friends." "I'm certain," Sebastian replied. "I've had my private investigators digging for the past 72 hours. Everything Natalie overheard checks out. The offshore accounts, the falsified environmental reports on the Riverside development, the bribes to city officials. It's all there. Diana nodded slowly. And the brake tampering? My mechanic found the cut lines yesterday. Very professional work. If I had driven up to the cabin this weekend as planned, I would have gone off that cliff exactly as they intended. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a life almost lost. Diana's expression hardened. She had known Sebastian since he was a young man trying to build his first property development, had watched him grow his empire through hard work and integrity. The betrayal of his oldest partner clearly struck a nerve. "Then we bring in Detective Morrison," she said. "I've worked with him before. He's clean, thorough, and he doesn't care how much money or influence someone has." What followed was a carefully orchestrated operation that would have made any crime drama proud. Detective Frank Morrison, a weathered man in his 40s with honest eyes and a reputation for integrity, coordinated with the FBI's white-collar crime division. Wiretaps were authorized, surveillance was established, and a trap was carefully set. The key to everything was making Victor and his co-conspirator, a businessman named James Carver, believe their plan was still unknown and still viable. Throughout it all, Natalie continued her work at the estate, moving through the halls with the same quiet efficiency, but now carrying the weight of what she had set in motion. Sebastian had wanted to move her somewhere safe, but she had refused. "If I suddenly disappear, they'll know something is wrong," she had argued during a late-night phone call. "I can be your eyes and ears inside the house." He hadn't liked it, but he had respected her judgment. And so Natalie became an unlikely spy, noting who came and went, what conversations floated through half-open doors, all while maintaining her facade of invisible servitude. It was Oliver who noticed the change in his sister most clearly. One evening, as they shared dinner in their small kitchen, he set down his fork and looked at her seriously. "You're different," he said. "Not bad different. Just different. Like you're bigger somehow." Natalie smiled, reaching across to squeeze his hand. "Maybe I'm just finally taking up the space I was always meant to occupy." The final confrontation came on a Thursday afternoon. Victor Brennan and James Carver had called an emergency board meeting, planning to present falsified evidence of Sebastian's mental instability and push for his removal as CEO. They believed they were executing the final phase of their plan, cleaning up loose ends now that Sebastian was supposed to be dead. Instead, they walked into a boardroom where Detective Morrison and 2 FBI agents waited alongside Sebastian, Diana, and a journalist named Lauren Webb who had been investigating corruption in the real estate industry for years. The color drained from Victor's face. James Carver actually took a step backward, as if he could somehow retreat from the moment. "Gentlemen," Sebastian said, his voice cold and controlled, "please sit down. We have a great deal to discuss." What followed was a systematic dismantling of years of corruption. The wiretaps had captured everything, including conversations about additional crimes beyond Sebastian's attempted murder. Embezzlement, bribery, fraud, and a pattern of environmental violations that had endangered entire communities. Victor tried to bluster, to threaten, to buy his way out. James Carver simply sat in shocked silence, all his carefully constructed confidence crumbling. "You made one critical mistake," Sebastian said as the handcuffs were being applied. "You forgot that the people you treat as invisible are still people, still watching, still capable of courage you could never understand." Later that evening, after the arrests and the initial wave of media coverage, Sebastian found himself back in his study, the same room where Victor had plotted his death, now reclaimed as a space of justice rather than betrayal. There was a soft knock at the door. Natalie entered, no longer in her maid's uniform but in simple jeans and a sweater. She looked younger without the severe bun and formal clothing, more herself. "Mrs. Chen said you wanted to see me," she said. Sebastian stood, gesturing to the chairs by the fireplace rather than maintaining the distance of desk and standing supplicant. "As equals, not employer and employee. I wanted to thank you properly," he said, "and to tell you that I've set up a trust fund for Oliver's education. Full ride through college, whatever school he chooses." Natalie's eyes widened. "Sir, I didn't do this for reward." "I know. That's exactly why you deserve it." He paused, then continued more quietly. "I've also been thinking. The Echo Foundation, my nonprofit for corporate whistleblowers, needs a director. Someone who understands what it means to risk everything for the truth. Someone who has lived it. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a partnership. Your story, what you did, it represents everything the foundation stands for. Who better to lead it than someone who embodied that courage?" Natalie sat down slowly, processing. "I'm a maid. I don't have a degree in nonprofit management or business or whatever qualifications you need. You have something more valuable. You have integrity, courage, and empathy. The rest we can teach you. Diana has already agreed to mentor you. Lauren Webb wants to feature your story in her next article. With your permission, of course." Tears filled Natalie's eyes, but she blinked them back. "Why? Why are you doing all this?" Sebastian was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Because 3 days ago, I was planning to drive up a mountain road, completely unaware that I would never make it home. You saved my life at enormous personal risk. You reminded me that the measures we use to judge people, money, status, power, they're all meaningless compared to character. And your character shines brighter than anyone I've ever known." He turned to look at her. "You also reminded me who I wanted to be when I started this company. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing the people who made my life possible. The staff, the workers, all the Natalies of the world moving invisibly through spaces I took for granted. You made me visible to myself again, showed me my own blindness." Natalie wiped her eyes, a small smile breaking through. "Oliver is going to lose his mind when I tell him about the trust fund. He wants to be an engineer." "Then he'll be an engineer," Sebastian said simply. "And you'll be changing the world, one whistleblower at a time." 3 months later, the Echo Foundation held its official launch. Natalie Harper stood at the podium, no longer invisible, no longer afraid. She told her story to a room full of people who needed to hear it, people who had witnessed wrongdoing and stayed silent out of fear. "I was just a maid," she said. "I had every reason to look away, to protect myself and my brother. But I realized something important. Silence protects the powerful. Speaking up protects everyone else. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth, even when your voice shakes." Sebastian watched from the side of the room, pride evident in his expression. Beside him, Oliver Harper grinned, wearing his first suit and looking impossibly grown up. "Your sister is amazing," Sebastian told the boy. "I know," Oliver replied. "She always has been. People just couldn't see it before." That evening, as the city lights began to twinkle and the Foundation's celebration wound down, Sebastian and Natalie found themselves alone on the rooftop terrace. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the first hints of winter. "Nervous about your first day?" Sebastian asked. "The Foundation officially opened its doors next week." "Terrified," Natalie admitted, "but also excited. Is that normal?" "Completely," he assured her. "The best things in life usually terrify us at first." They stood in comfortable silence, two people from completely different worlds who had found common ground in the most unexpected way. A maid and a billionaire, united by courage and transformed by truth. "Thank you," Natalie said finally, "for believing me, for taking action, for giving me this chance." Sebastian shook his head. "Thank you for reminding me what matters, for being brave when it counted most, for not staying silent when silence would have been easier." As the city spread out before them, full of lights and lives and infinite possibilities, they both understood something fundamental had shifted. Not just in their own lives, but in how they moved through the world. Natalie Harper had stopped being invisible. Sebastian Cross had started truly seeing. And together, they would help others find their voices in a world that too often demanded silence. The maid had whispered a warning to the billionaire, and in doing so had changed both their destinies forever. Because that's what truth does. It echoes, it amplifies, and it transforms everyone brave enough to speak it aloud. And sometimes, it takes just one voice in the darkness to light the way for countless others. The end of their story was really just the beginning.